Ruth Calder had just covered her husband with the last shovelful of frozen earth, when a rider stopped on the ridge and watched her like he had come to inspect the burial. Dawn was pale over the churchyard. Her hands were blistered through her gloves, clay streaked her black dress, and the cedar marker she had carved by lantern light leaned crooked in the hard ground. Eli Calder. A decent man. No dates. There had been no time for dates. The rider came down at an easy pace, horse stepping neat through the frost-burned grass. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. By a warm stove, or in a quiet chair, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. It always does a body good to know who is sharing the fire. Ruth planted the shovel and waited. She knew the man before his boots hit the ground. Silas Bell, owner of the grain mill, the freight yard, and the note ledger that seemed to have half Cotton Bray's soul pinned beneath it. He glanced at the grave, then at Ruth, with the smooth calm of a man who never entered any place expecting resistance. "No minister?" he asked. "No one came. Hard thing burying your husband alone." Ruth studied him. He was handsome, the way some knives were handsome. Pale eyes, trim beard, a voice polished bright enough to make strangers trust it. "Hard things keep happening around your business," she said. A faint smile touched his mouth. "Eli should have signed when I offered mercy." 3 nights before he died, Eli had told her, "If anything happens to me, don't let Bell write the story of it." Bell pinched fresh dirt from the grave mound and let it sift through his fingers. "The note comes due at sundown. After that, the house, the pasture, all of it transfers to me." Ruth had $6, 1 lame mule, and a wedding ring she would rather have swallowed than sold to him. Eli was current, until you changed the grain weights. Bell's smile cooled. "Careful. A grieving widow accusing a respectable man can sound unwell." He stepped closer. "There are women who know when a thing is lost, and women who make themselves troublesome. The second kind usually ends colder." Men had warned Ruth about herself since she was a girl. Too broad, too loud, too much. Eli had been the first person who looked at her size and saw strength before spectacle. Now Bell had come to see whether the widow he left behind could be frightened smaller. Ruth slid the shovel free. "You should go," Bell mounted without haste. "By dusk, Mrs. Calder, this land won't know your name." He rode off without looking back. Men who feared consequences always looked over their shoulders. Bell did not. That told Ruth more than his threats had. She stood alone until the hoofbeats died. She wanted to kneel and tell Eli she did not know how to hold a day like this by herself. But grief had never settled a debt or outrun a liar with a deed in his pocket. So she did what she always did first when life turned cruel. She worked. By the time she reached home, the town already knew she had buried Eli alone. The Calder place sat west of Cotton Bray. Small house, wide porch, leaning barn, stubborn ground. Eli had built the porch step extra wide because he said tired people deserved a place to sit before they decided whether to come in. He had hung the kitchen door straight 3 separate times because the desert wind loved working mischief into the hinges. On summer nights, he sat on the rail with coffee in both hands and judged the tomato patch as if it were a neighboring county that needed governing. Every inch of the place held some small evidence that a decent man had once risen early here and expected to die old. That was what Bell did not understand. He thought land was boards, wire, water rights, and figures in columns. He did not understand that a house could keep the shape of a laugh long after the mouth that made it was gone. He did not understand that a field remembered the people who had bent over it together. Ruth stood for a moment with her hand on the porch post, breathing in dust, old cedar, and the faint ash smell that clung to Eli's work coat, still hanging just inside the door, and felt grief hit her fresh and low, like the kick of a horse she should have known better than to stand behind. She had just unharnessed the mule when Deputy Noah Vale came through the gate. Noah was a quiet man with a weathered face, a bad shoulder, and the stillness of someone who had seen enough shouting to distrust it. "I went to the church," he said. "You were late. Bell sent me chasing a false fire." Regret tightened his mouth. "Eli came to me 3 weeks ago. He'd copied Bell's ledgers and meant to expose him. My office was turned over the night before Eli died. The only thing really taken was Eli's note telling me where he'd hidden the copies." Ruth felt the kitchen door behind her like an ache. If she wanted the easy path, she could pack and be gone before Bell returned. The house would be lost, Eli's name buried, but she would live. Noah saw the thought move through her. "If you leave, no one will blame you. They'll say, 'Bell was right,'" she said. "And you'll let that stand?" Not if there's any way left to stop it. That was the trouble with honest men. They never sold comfort cheap. Ruth looked toward the porch rail. Eli hid peppermint drops in ridiculous places because he liked watching me find them. If he left proof, he hid it like a husband, not a martyr. We start with the ordinary. They searched the house from stove to rafters, under flour tins, behind the bread box, beneath a loose board by the stove where Ruth kept coffee money in bad winters. Dust floated through the kitchen in warm slants, and every ordinary thing seemed sharpened by loss. Eli's hat on the peg, Eli's whetstone by the sink, the cup with a chipped blue rim he had favored for no reason anyone else could see. In the bedroom, Noah found Ruth's brass hair comb wrapped in muslin. She brushed a thumb over the mended hinge. My mother's. Eli fixed it. Said precious things shouldn't break twice if a man could help it. He sounds like a man worth missing, Noah said. Before she could answer, Martha Hennessy came in with soup, shawl pinned crooked, and eyes bright with the sort of fury respectable women learned to tuck beneath their aprons. She warned that Bell meant to return at sundown with witnesses so he could make a spectacle of the eviction. Then she produced the church donation box key. Eli had repaired that lock last month and spent an oddly long time doing it. Martha's mouth thinned. Your husband wasn't a foolish man. If he put his hands on that box longer than a repair required, he meant somebody honest to notice later. She set the soup down hard enough to rattle the spoons. And if Bell thinks he's marching into your yard at sundown to perform righteousness, I hope he enjoys surprises. Ruth and Noah looked at each other. If Eli wanted to hide something in plain sight, he could not have chosen better. If you were in her place right then, would you go after the proof or flee while daylight still gave you a chance? Tell me in the comments. The hardest choices are the ones where survival and dignity stop walking in the same direction. They crossed the north pasture on foot. At the fence line, Ruth slipped, and Noah caught her elbow before she fell. The touch was brief and steady, yet being steadied at all struck her strangely. I'm not made of glass, she said. No, Noah answered. Glass doesn't pull plows free when a mule quits. She looked at him. Who told you that? Your husband. Said you once dragged a broken harrow 40 yards because weather was turning, and stubbornness ran stronger in you than in any beast he owned. He stepped over the rail. He talked about you, the way thirsty men talk about wells. That stayed with her all the way to the church. The church stood empty beneath the cottonwoods. Ruth opened the donation box. Inside lay a packet wrapped in oilcloth and one peppermint drop. Freight tallies, receipts, land notes, Bell's figures in black, Eli's corrections beside them in pencil, and, at the bottom, a folded letter. Ruth, if you're reading this, Bell moved before I could. Don't take these pages to Sheriff Pike. Take them to Noah Vale. And if I don't get to tell you plain, hear it now. There was never a day on this earth I was made more able by anything than by being loved by you. The church blurred. Noah turned away to give her privacy. When she handed him the ledgers, his face hardened at once. This is enough to ruin him. A floorboard cracked behind them. Clive Turner stood in the doorway with a shotgun and another rider behind him. Mr. Bell guessed you might come sniffing around, he said. Noah shifted between Ruth and the gun. You want to think about this. Thinking's done. Ruth saw the bell rope and moved first. She smashed the donation box into Clive's face. The shotgun blasted the doorframe. Noah fired. The second rider dropped. Clive lunged again, and Ruth drove her shoulder into him with all the force 40 years of being told she was too much had packed into her bones. He crashed into a pew. Noah grappled with him. Ruth seized the bell rope and threw her full weight backward. The bell exploded above them. Clive panicked. A weekday church bell meant people. Ruth yanked the rope sideways, then brought the brass box down on his wrist. Bone cracked. He screamed. Hooves pounded outside. Voices rose. Noah shouted, Ruth, the papers! She snatched up the packet and turned as Silas Bell stepped into the side doorway, revolver already drawn. For one strange second, the whole room seemed to hold its breath with her. Sunlight cut through the church windows in hard, pale bars. Dust from the blasted doorframe drifted like smoke. Clive groaned on the floor. The wounded rider cursed outside. Somewhere down the lane, wagon wheels rattled fast over ruts as people answered the bell. Ruth could hear the town arriving before she could see it, and the sound did something to her. Fear was still there, sharp as ever, but it was no longer lonely. Others were coming. Others had heard. Bell heard them too. That was why his face looked different, not merely angry, cornered. Men like him could survive being hated. What they could not survive was being watched. At the exact moment their lies stopped working, all the charm was gone from Bell now. He took in Clive on the floor, the blood at Ruth's temple, and the faces gathering outside. His revolver settled on Noah. "Let him up, or I'll put a hole through the lawman." Noah did not move. Bell looked at Ruth. "You're one widow with dirt on her sleeves. By tomorrow these people will remember who keeps them fed." All day fear had lived in Ruth like a second heart. Then Bell smiled over Noah's bent body, and something inside her went still. He expected surrender because he had spent his life teaching other people to shrink. Ruth stepped in front of Noah. "Move," Bell said. "No, I'll shoot, then do it in front of everybody." Faces filled the doorway. Ruth lifted a sheet and read Bell's theft aloud. "Bledsoe, Hennessy, Widow Pruitt, the Calders." The murmur that answered was not surprise but recognition. "Lies," Bell snapped. "Then why are you armed in a church?" Martha fired back. People began stepping in. What would you have done right there, with the truth finally standing in daylight and a loaded gun still pointed at it? Would you have looked away to save your own skin, or stepped forward? Bell saw fear shifting sides. He raised the gun higher. Ruth ripped the packet open and flung the pages into the air. Paper rose through the church light like white birds. Sheets scattered into waiting hands. "Now, you can't kill one truth," Ruth said. "You'd have to kill the whole valley," Bell fired. Noah fired back. Bell's revolver spun from his hand, and he dropped with a shattered wrist. Tom Bledsoe kicked the gun away. Widow Pruitt stooped for a page and muttered, "Well, I'll be damned in public." The church broke open into action. Men gathered papers, women read numbers aloud. Noah snapped irons on Bell. Ruth stood in the middle of it all with blood drying at her temple and Eli's handwriting rustling through 50 hands. Then the strength went out of her. She slipped through the side door and around the church to the cottonwoods where the creek ran low between stones. There she sat hard on a root and pressed one hand over her mouth. A minute later, Boots stopped nearby, not close enough to crowd her. Noah lowered himself onto the root beside her, moving carefully around his bruised ribs, and offered his canteen. For a while they listened to the creek and the muted uproar inside the church. The world beyond the cottonwoods sounded as if it were remaking itself, one startled voice at a time. Finally Noah said, "You rang the whole valley in with one rope and a terrible idea." It was an excellent idea. The corner of his mouth moved. Terrifying and excellent are near cousins. The warmth of that almost undid her more than the fight had. Then he looked down at his hands. "I should have been at the burial. You were where Bell sent you. Still, my wife died 4 winters ago while I was away on duty. Folks told me there was nothing I could have done. Didn't stop me from feeling like I left the door open for death and called it duty." Ruth turned toward him. In small towns, a woman's grief arrived in casseroles and lowered voices. A man's grief usually just put on a coat and went silent. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded. "I don't tell you for pity, only so you know when I look at lonely, I ain't guessing." She unfolded Eli's letter again. The paper shook once in her hand. "He always knew where my worst thoughts lived," she said softly. "Before I married him, people used to talk about me like I was built wrong for tenderness. Useful, maybe. Strong, certainly, but not the sort of woman a man chose first. Eli used to hear that sort of thing and look at people like they'd announced they couldn't tell daylight from lantern smoke. When he wrote that, he was made more able by being loved by me. I believed him. But belief is a slippery thing when a cruel man speaks in the old language you've been hurt by before." Noah did not rush to fill the silence. That, more than anything, made it safe. "When Bell called me a cow in there," Ruth went on, "part of me was 12 again, wishing I could take up less room in the world." Noah answered without hurry. "Room isn't the same thing as burden. Some things are meant to take up space. Barns, mountains, women who know when a rotten man should fall." That broke her in the quietest way. Ruth laughed shakily through her tears. "That line ought to be painted on a barn wall. Wouldn't fit my handwriting." He drew out her wedding ring. "Found this on the washstand." She stared at the ring in his palm. She had taken it off before digging, because the cold had swollen her fingers, and in the storm of the day she had forgotten where she left it. Seeing it there struck her almost as hard as Eli's letter had. A marriage reduced to a circle of gold, and not reduced at all. If this story is reaching you, you're exactly who it was written for. A like and a subscribe Tell us to keep making room for stories where quiet goodness finally gets seen clearly. Ruth slid the ring back on. It fit tight, but it fit. Noah rose and offered her a hand. Come see what your courage started. She took it, and for one suspended second neither of them let go. By late afternoon, the sanctuary looked less like a church than a reckoning table. Bell sat bandaged and pale while every falsified debt was read aloud. Reverend Pike returned, saw the ledgers and murmured, "Well, pride does travel with poor bookkeeping." Before sunset, Noah had sent copies to Judge Mercer and the state marshal. Then the town did something Ruth had not prepared for. It turned toward her in shame and gratitude. Tom Bledsoe admitted Eli had warned him. Martha pressed soup into Ruth's hands. Widow Pruitt promised half the widows in the valley would sleep on Ruth's porch before Bell's fraud stood. For a long breath, nobody answered. Then heads began to lower, not in shame alone but in recognition. Ruth saw it move through the room the way weather moved through grass. The Hennessy boy biting his lip, old Bledsoe staring at the floorboards, Martha squaring her narrow shoulders, as if someone had finally spoken aloud the thing all of them had been carrying. Fear, Ruth understood then, was never the proof of weakness Bell had claimed it was. It was simply the price decent people paid for living too long under the reach of cruel ones. Ruth told them the plainest truth she had. I was afraid all day. I was just more tired of bowing than I was afraid of standing. Noah stepped beside her. Silas Bell is under arrest for fraud, coercion, attempted murder, and conspiracy in the death of Eli Calder. His properties are subject to seizure and audit. 2 hours before sundown, the crowd Bell had hoped to use as witness against Ruth walked him through town in irons. No cheering, no jeering. Just the heavy silence of people watching power leave a man who had long mistaken it for worth. Ruth did not join the procession. She went home. The sky had turned amber over the bluffs. The house looked exactly as it had that morning, and nothing at all like it had then. Same porch, same barn, same pump. But fear no longer stood in the doorway before her. Noah caught up, just as she set Martha's empty bowl on the rail. Judge Mercer will ride in by noon tomorrow, he said. Marshal by morning after. Bell's offices are under watch. With those pages and these witnesses, he'll never touch your land again. Ruth nodded. Thank you. For which part? Showing up, even late. He stood at the foot of the steps, hat in both hands. I know what day this is, he said. I'm not foolish enough to crowd grief, but I'd insult us both if I pretended I didn't notice what kind of woman stood in that church today. Warmth moved through her. That sounds suspiciously like courting language. Color touched his ears. Courting language is smoother. That was a man speaking plain, because he's too old to risk missing what matters twice. Ruth looked at him a long moment. I loved my husband well. I know. And grief doesn't unlatch because somebody good comes knocking. I know that too. That made all the difference. Then come by Sunday after church, she said. I'll make coffee. For the first time all day, he smiled fully. I'd be honored. At the gate he paused. Some things wait years for the day they stop being afraid to be seen. Bell's ruin came complete. Judge Mercer arrived. The ledgers were seized. The bank agent confessed, and Clive Turner traded testimony for mercy. Bell had sent men to frighten Eli at the Flood Creek. One shove in bad water had done the rest. Silas Bell did not leave Cotton Bray on horseback. He left in a prison wagon while the town lined the street in silence. Ruth watched from the mercantile porch. And when Bell found her eyes, what he saw was not revenge, but a woman he had failed to make smaller. The Calder note was voided. The south pasture remained hers. Eli's name was entered properly in the church record. Tom Bledsoe repaired Ruth's fence. Daniel Hennessy mended the church door. Martha brought soup, until Ruth told her future charity must arrive in pie. For the first time since Eli's death, the farm no longer felt like a thing waiting to be taken. It felt like a place that had chosen to remain. Sunday came bright and windless. After church, Noah walked to the Calder place with coffee beans in brown paper. They drank from mismatched mugs on the porch and spoke plainly of grief, weather, trials, and the dead. Conversation with him was easy in the strangest possible way. Not easy because nothing hurt. Easy because neither of them lied about what still did. At one point Noah said, I used to think healing happened all at once. Ruth looked over the field. No, it's more like tending ground after hail. You don't make it what it was. You help it grow anyway. He smiled into his cup. That sounds like something worth remembering. By late summer, people no longer called it the day Bell fell, but the day the valley stood up. That mattered to Ruth. Fear had made Bell powerful, yes, but courage had not belonged to one person alone. It had moved from hand to hand like the ledger pages in the church. On the first cool evening of September, Ruth walked to Eli's grave with a peppermint drop in her pocket. She set it at the stone and murmured, "You were right. Ordinary places do hide the things that save us." Boots sounded behind her. Noah stood there with 2 cups of coffee. Ruth turned, and what she felt was not betrayal of the dead, but a gentler truth. Love did not leave to make room for more life. It taught the heart how to keep a light in more than one window. He held out a cup. "Thought you might need warming." She took it. Their fingers brushed, and neither of them hurried to pretend it meant less than it did. Months later, on a porch still warm from the day's sun, Ruth sat beside Noah while the first stars came up over the pasture and tomatoes glowed red in the garden Eli had planted. Children's laughter drifted from Martha Hennessy's yard down the lane. The house Bell tried to take stood full of lamplight, coffee, and the quiet company of a man who knew how to stay without crowding. Ruth listened to the crickets, felt Noah's shoulder resting easy against hers, and thought that maybe the heart was truest not when it never broke, but when it learned, after all that weather, to remain a place where something living could still come home. The porch boards held the day's warmth, the pasture breathed in the dark. And when she looked out over the land that had nearly been stolen from her, it no longer looked like a battleground, it looked like a life. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf woman sent to a lonely Wyoming ranch because her own brothers were ashamed of her silence, and the blind horsebreaker who saw her courage before anyone else learned how to look.